The time for convening has arrived, and the Senate will now come to order, which won't be very hard. This time I'd like to ask that all unauthorized persons exit the chamber. And it is my honor to recognize the sometimes referred to as wise, the sometimes referred to as powerful, chairman from the 53rd.
Mr. President, it is crossover day, not cross-dressing day, but crossover day. And we appreciate the leadership you give the state of Georgia and the wonderful men and women who served the state senate. Moment in time. In 1990, Clarence Thomas took the oath of office of District of Columbia Court Circuit for the U.S. Court of Appeals, and now he's the longest-serving justice of the of the United States Supreme Court. The journal's been read and found to be correct, and it's a biggin, as my son would say.
Is there objection to dispensing with the reading of the journal? The chair hears none, and the reading of the journal is dispensed with. Is there objection to the confirmation of the journal? The chair hears none, and the journal is confirmed. All senators who have bills and resolutions, please bring them to the Secretary's desk at this time. Mr. Secretary, first reading of Senate bills and resolutions, please.
Senate Bill number 502 by Senator Beach of the 21st. A bill to be titled An Act to Amend an Act Reincorporating and Recreating the City of Woodstock, approved April 17, 1975, as amended, particularly by an act
State and local government.
Senate Bill 503 by Senator Strickland of the 17th and others. A bill to be titled An Act to Amend Article 4 of Chapter 18 of Title 50 of the OCGA, relating to inspection of public records. So as
Rules.
to make Senate Bill 504 by Senator Ligon of the 3rd. A bill to be titled An Act to Provide for a Non-Binding Advisory Referendum for the purpose of ascertaining whether the electors of Glynn County desire the Glynn County Board of Commissioners to abolish
State and local government.
Senate Resolution 938 by Senator Beach of the 21st and others. A resolution urging the United States Federal Communications Commission to reconsider its proposed rule regarding the use of
Regulated industries.
Senate Resolution 940 by Senator Martin of the 9th and others. A resolution recognizing the Honorable Charlotte Nash and dedicating intersection in her honor and for other purposes.
Transportation.
That completes order, Mr. President.
Mr. Secretary, first reading and reference of House bills and resolutions, please.
House Bill 216 by Representative Anulowicz of the 42nd. A bill to be titled An Act to Amend Code Section 4286 of the OCGA, relating to special license plates promoting and supporting certain worthy agencies, funds.
Public safety.
House Bill 245 by Representative Buckner of the 137th and others. A bill to be titled An Act to Amend Code Section 471780 of the Official Code of Georgia Annotated, relating to retirement benefit options, payment to surviving spouse.
Retirement.
House Bill 791 by Representative Stevens of the 164th. A bill to be titled An Act to Amend Code Section 26480 of the OCGA, relating to license required for practice of pharmacy, dispensing prescription
Health and Human
drugs.
Services.
House Bill 807 by Representative Montana of the 17th and others. A bill to be titled An Act to Amend Code Section 481314 of the OCGA, relating to levy on business or practitioner.
Finance.
House Bill 879 by Representative Harrell of the 106 and others. A bill to be titled An Act to Amend Article 1 of Chapter 3 of Title 3 of the OCGA, relating to provisions regarding the regulation of alcoholic beverages generally, so to provide for legislative.
Regulated industries.
House Bill 913 by Representative Reeves of the 34th and others. A bill to be titled An Act to Amend Title 19 of the OCGA, relating to domestic relations, so as to strengthen, clarify, and update provisions.
Judiciary.
House Bill 949 by Representative Carson of the 46th and others. A bill to be titled An Act to Amend Title 48 of the OCGA, relating to revenue and taxation, so as to define the terms
Finance.
House Bill 1006 by Representative Jackson of the 64th and others. A bill to be titled An Act to Provide for the selection of the Chief Judge of the Atlanta Judicial Circuit, to provide for terms, to provide for powers and duties, to provide for a specific repealer, to repeal conflicting laws, and for other purposes.
State and local government.
House Bill 1025 by Representative Setzler of the 35th and others. A bill to be titled An Act to Amend an Act to Reincorporate and provide a new charter for the City of Ackworth, approved February 17th, 1989, as amended particularly by an act approved May 6, 2019, so as to adopt by reference a
State and local government.
House Bill 1075 by Representative Holland of the 54th and others. A bill to be titled An Act to Amend an Act to continue the existence of the Atlanta Independent School System under the management and control of the Atlanta Board of Education.
State and local government.
House Bill 1082 by Representative Powell of the 32nd and others. A bill to be titled An Act to Amend Article 1A of Chapter 11 of Title 40 of the OCGA, relating to abandoned motor vehicles, so as to provide for notification.
Public safety.
House Bill 1087 by Representative Turner of the 21st and others. A bill to be titled An Act to provide for a homestead exemption from the City of Holly Springs ad valorem taxes for municipal purposes in the amount of up to $409.
State and local government.
House Bill 1088 by Representative Jones of the 167th. A bill to be entitled An Act to Amend an Act creating the new charter for the City of Ludowici, approved April 18th, 1923, as amended, so as to change the corporate limits
State
of the
and
city.
local government.
House Bill 1094 by Representative Gaines of the 117th and others. A bill to be entitled An Act to Amend Article 1 of Chapter 20 of Title 45 of the OCGA, relating to general provisions regarding personal administration, personnel,
Insurance and Labor.
House Bill 1110 by Representative Hatchett, the 150th. A bill entitled An Act to Amend an Act to provide for a new charter of the City of East Dublin, approved April 9th, 1981, as amended, presented by an act approved April 13th, 1994.
State and local government.
House Bill 1114 by Representative Cooper, the 43rd, and others. A bill entitled An Act to amend Article 7 of Chapter 4 of Title 49 of the OCGA, relating to medical assistance generally, so as to provide for Medicaid coverage for lactation care and services.
Health and Human Services.
Back, please, order, Mr. President.
Ms. Secretary, will you now read reports of standing committees, please?
Mr. President, the Senate Committee on Finance has had on consideration the following legislation and is directed to report the same back to the Senate with the following recommendation. House Bill 779 do pass. House Bill 808 do pass. Respectfully submitted by Senator Hufsteller of the 52nd District, Chair. Mr. President, Senate Committee on State and Local Governmental Operations has had on consideration the following legislation and is directed to report the same back to the Senate with the following recommendation. House Bill 1016 do pass. Respectfully submitted by Senator Anderson of the 24th District, Chair. That completes the order, Mr. President.
All right, it's now time for our morning roll call. It is now time for our morning roll call. Text, call, or smoke signal your friends in the hallway and let them know we're about ready to start morning roll call. Are there any motions to excuse? Any motions to excuse? The chair recognizes the senator from the 28th.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask for unanimous consent to excuse the senator from the 45th for business inside the Capitol.
Without objection, the senator from the 45th is excused. Nice looking haircut, Senator. Any other motions to excuse? The chair sees none. The secretary will call the roll of senators. Signify your presence by voting the yea switch. The secretary will unlock the machine. All right, it's now time for a morning devotional. I know we've got a lot going on here, but it's now time for a morning devotional. I'd like to ask that all senators, please take your seats and cease all audible conversations. I'd like to ask our doorkeepers to secure the chamber at this time. It's my honor to recognize the senator from the 16th to lead us in our Pledge of Allegiance and to introduce our chaplain of the day.
Good morning, the American flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Our state flag. I pledge allegiance to the state flag, to the principles for which it stands, wisdom, justice, and moderation. Well, good morning, and I'd like to introduce to you this morning the pastor of the day, Dr. Lou Sterrett. We had a hip-hop star who gave it, and now we're going to have a cowboy preacher. Dr. Lou Sterrett is a preacher of the gospel of Jesus Christ, a licensed youth and family counselor, a world-class horse trainer, and horse whisperer. He speaks to businesses on leadership and relationships and is best known as the Sermon on the Mount. As he preaches and teaches on horseback, and he actually breaks a horse that has never been ridden, and he'll usually do it in about an hour as he preaches a message at the same time. His message is, as we horses yield to the hand of the master, so we are to yield to the hand of our ultimate master, the Lord Jesus Christ. He is a friend, an encourager, and I am pleased to ask you to give your attention to him. Dr. Lou Sterrett, would you share with us, please?
Thank you, my friend. And I'll tell you what, when you let cowboys in here, you really need to adjust your protocol. That's just how it is. But honored to be with you this morning. You know, I have a friend, in fact, I'm not so sure a friend. He calls me up once in a while and he says, Lou, you got a glass of water? And I said, yeah. He said, well, put your finger in it and see how much of an impression you're making. Yeah, right. Well, that's about how life goes sometimes. But you know, I don't need to lecture you about the brevity of life or the vanity of life. You know, when it's all said and done, the scripture says, all flesh is like the grass, and its glory like the flower thereof. The grass withers, the flower falls off, but the word of the Lord abides forever. When it's all said and done in our lives, friends, whether it's an individual or a nation, we get one of two words on our epitaph. We get one of two words on our headstone, written by the Almighty. Faithful or unfaithful. Pretty inclusive connotation. You know, when we speak about Christians, we're called faithful followers of Christ. And so they became followers and so forth. And leadership, since I do a lot of leadership training, is more about who you listen to, why you listen to them, and what you do with what you listen. And obviously, some of the greatest leaders in the world have been the greatest followers of life. And so Jesus, in telling us that, tells us how to be followers of him. And today, knowing the tremendous concerns that you occupy in your lives and the importance of your decisions, I would like to encourage you how to lighten your burden today. Jesus said this, come unto me, all ye that are weary and heavy laden, and take my yoke upon you. For I am meek and lowly, and you shall find rest for your souls. Today I'd ask you, what does a horse have to teach us about leadership? Tremendously amount. In a short time, if you go back to the Ringling Barnum Circus, you go to San Francisco and the Golden Gate Bridge, the Suspension Bridge, we also come into the concepts of what a horse teaches us about leadership. Because in each of those scenarios, there are two fulcrum points, either pillars that hold up the bridge or posts that hold up the big top. But in a horse's case, it's a set of front legs and a set of rear legs. And in the case of the bridge, we have a cable that runs all the way across the top and across the down. And of course, it's how it's anchored that determines the suspension of the bridge. If you ever wanted to play a dirty trick on one of the kids, you just go around and pull the tent pegs around and the tent collapses on whoever's inside. Now, don't tell anybody I told you that. But you see, with a horse, it's a little bit different. And the big top is held up by the same tension of those things. It's all about headship, isn't it? Because when a horse raises his head, and of course the only reason a horse raises his head is because he's afraid, or he wants to see from a distance. So it's the element, I want to be in control. A trial is any situation you and I feel out of control. Goodness, that happens a lot in our lives. So the horse raises his head. But when the horse raises his head, there's this ligament that comes from the back of the head, the pole, down his neck, up over his shoulders, across his back, over his hips, and down his tail line. And when he raises the head, because he wants to be in control and he wants to take headship for his life, guess what happens to that cord? It becomes slack. And the very burden on his back, the rider or the pack saddle or whatever it may be, becomes very heavy. The weight is multiplied exponentially. But you see, when the horse lowers his head, and the only reason a horse lowers his head is because he's safe or he honors the one who is the head. When he lowers his head and he rests in the goodness of his master, it automatically makes taut this cord, this ligament that comes across his back, and it thrusts the weight upward. His burden becomes light. And Jesus was using an illustration to you and I that we need to always be mindful that he's headship and to follow him, be faithful followers of him. Our little slogan that we teach a lot is follow closely, listen carefully, obey completely. Can I lead you in a word of prayer this morning? Our Heavenly Father, as we look to you this morning, we realize that our forefathers and our predecessors, Father, followed you from distant lands to this nation, to this land that was wild, We followed you through turmoil and through ignorance and through difficult times. We followed you when we wrote the Magna Carta. We followed you when we wrote the Constitution. We followed you when we built our educational institutions that honored you from the very beginning. We followed you when we embraced our government. We followed you, Father, when we established the mandates that would establish a family and taxation and government and all these institutions that we now occupy. But Lord, it's true that over the years, many times we've lifted our head because we've eaten of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and now we have burdens and responsibilities that are greater than we can bear. May we, as we humble ourselves today and honor you, may you give wisdom and direction and headship to every man and woman among us this day who will honor you and walk with you, that wisdom that comes from only you to make the mighty decisions that are so impact the generations to come. Bless this day and these dear people who follow you. In Jesus' name, amen.
Are there any unanimous consents? The chair sees none. Does any senator wish to rise on a point of personal privilege? Any senator wish to rise on a point of personal privilege? The chair sees none. You have a consent calendar of privilege resolutions before you. Does any senator wish to remove a resolution from the consent calendar? The chair sees none. Is there objection to the adoption of the resolutions on the consent calendar? The chair hears none. The resolutions on the consent calendar are adopted. Are there any motions to withdraw and commit? Chair sees none. You have a consent calendar of local bills before you. Mr. Secretary, are there any objections filed to any of the bills on the local consent calendar?
Mr. President, there are no objections filed.
Is there objection to agreeing to the report of the Committee on State and Local Government, which is favorable to the passage of the bills on the local consent calendar? Chair hears none, and the report of the committee is agreed to. Questions on the passage of the bills on the calendar. All those in favor will vote yea, opposed nay. The Secretary will unlock the machine. All right, we're now going to introduce our doctor of the day, and I'd like to call on our good friend, the senator from the 18th, to do so. Don't screw this up.
That's right. Good morning, colleagues. It is my pleasure to introduce to you.
Excuse me. I got so far out in front of myself, I forgot to announce the votes. On the passage of the bill, the yeas are 48, the nays are 0. The bills on the local consent calendar have received the requisite constitutional majority, are therefore passed. Now, we're going to introduce the doctor of the day.
Sorry. It's all right. Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning again. It is really my pleasure and honor to introduce to you a very good friend of mine, Dr. Steve Tuck from Macon. He's an internist. He's originally from Dalton, Georgia. Graduated from some little school over there in Alabama. I think he calls it the University of Alabama, and a proud graduate of Mercer University. Practices in Macon, and he's a great doctor for us to have with us today. And he's done this, how many years, doctor? About 15 years he's been coming down to visit us and be the doctor of the day. So y'all give a warm welcome, and let me introduce Dr. Steve Tuck.
It's always a pleasure to be here. I appreciate everything y'all do. I know y'all have a very busy day, so I will step aside and let y'all get back to work.
Chair recognizes the senator from the 4th.
I move the Senate adopt the conference committee report to House Bill 792. I'll take the well to explain.
Mr. Secretary, can you please read the caption?
The Committee of Conference on House Bill 792 recommends that both the House of Representatives and the Senate recede from their positions and that the attached Committee of Conference substitute to House Bill 792 be adopted. Respectfully submitted by Representative England of the 116th and Senator Hill of the 4th. A bill to be titled An Act to Amend an Act Making and Providing Appropriations for the State Fiscal Year beginning July 1st, 2019 and ending June 3rd, 2020, known as the General Appropriations Act, Act Number 319, approved May 10th, 2019, so as to make, provide, and change certain appropriations for the operation of the state government, its departments, boards, bureaus, commissions, institutions, and other agencies, and for other purposes. That completes the order, Mr. President.
The chair recognizes the senator from the 4th to speak to his motion.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen of the Senate. I bring you the Conference Committee report on House Bill 792, the amended FY 2020 budget. On your desk this morning is a handout that has the highlights of the amended budget in the beginning and then the agreements and the other portions of the handout. Something good that you can take with you as you inform your constituents of what we've done with the amended budget. First, this is going to be very quick, so pay attention and we'll get right to it. First of all, I want to thank the budget staff who worked very long and hard to put together this budget, and then worked in conference with the House to work together for a conference committee report that you can vote on today. The conferees, President Pro Tem and the Majority Leader, Lieutenant Governor's staff, we appreciate your attention in all this, as well as our meetings with the Governor's staff and getting the Governor's input as well. We appreciate the continued cooperation of the House Budget Chairman Terry England, and his budget staff has made the whole process go very smoothly. These are very quickly some of the highlights of the amended budget, some of which you have probably already read about in the press today. By now, you're probably aware that the Governor has raised the revenue estimate in the FY 2020 budget by $100 million out of the rainy day fund, out of the revenue shortfall reserve, in order to provide for a response to the coronavirus crisis that our state faces as well. So the revenue from the $100 million we placed in the Governor's emergency fund, if those funds are not expended by the end of this fiscal year, they will lapse back into the emergency fund. So we basically put a number on it in order to have those funds that we would, of course, the things that these would be used for would be in response, if we receive emergency aid from the federal government, that's a 25% match. So every dollar that we got from the federal government, we would match it with 25%. So that those funds would come from that. As to the extent that we assist local governments, these funds would help to do that, as well as all the costs that are going to be involved in our responses from the Department of Public Health and other agencies and state government. So that's the $100 million. That's the biggest item in the conference committee report. Secondly, the other important item is the $5 million that was appropriated for rural hospital relief. This is going to the Rural Hospital Stabilization Grant Program, which will help, we hope, keep some rural hospitals in business during this critical period as well. We've added $400,000 into the Department of Education for a true-up for the advanced placement exams that we pay for in both the basic exam and the STEM exams as well under existing programs. This just trues up the number based on the number of tests that are going to be needed. The House agreed to the Senate's restoration of cuts in maternal health that we restored, cuts in foster care services, and developmental disabilities. All of those restorations that you saw in the Senate budget were maintained in the conference committee report. The House agreed to add $1.5 million for a total of $3 million for a major economic development effort at the Middle Georgia Regional Airport. There are a couple of bills going through the legislature dealing with pharmacy benefit managers. We've added $175,000 for the Department of Community Health to perform the study that is being called for in this legislation. We fully restored the cut of $6.3 million to county boards of health. So if your county was one of those affected, they will not be cut at all. Virtually all of the Senate restorations that were made, and to some degree not any great negotiating skill, but frankly because in many cases we're the last one to get data on changes, and our data maybe is a little more up to date. So we maintained many of the Senate restorations, and those kind of put together a budget that we think will get our state through the end of this fiscal year, and we look forward to the 21 budget negotiations and development effort as we move forward in the next few days. Mr. President, that concludes my presentation. Be happy to try to answer any questions. Melody Busey with the Budget Office is over here as well. We can either one try to answer questions.
Chair recognizes the minority leader for a question.
Senator Yield.
Yes, sir.
Senator, is it not true that the budget was just placed on our desk this morning, and although it's exempt from the rule about an hour layover, it's kind of expedient to have us vote on it right now? In general, I don't have any problems with the budget, but do you feel you're giving us enough time to look over it?
Well, that's a matter for the president of this body to consider. We basically concluded the negotiations yesterday afternoon. Obviously, time is of the essence in releasing these funds for the governor to be able to react. We were trying to get it passed as quickly as possible so that the governor could sign it today and be able to start dispensing those funds as necessary. So it was, of course, we're in the beginning of the process on the 21 budget as well, so we saw no reason to delay it. Frankly, we've got a lot of business today, and I wanted to get this out of the way so we have time to transmit the budget to the governor today.
You have no more questions, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. President. Appreciate your cooperation and your vote on House Bill Conference Committee report on House Bill 792. Thank you.
Does any other senator wish to speak for or against the motion on House Bill 792? The chair sees none. The question is on the adoption of the Conference Committee report on House Bill 792. All those in favor of adopting the Conference Committee report will vote yea. Opposed, nay. The Secretary will unlock the machine. On the motion, the yeas are 53, the nays are 1. The motion has prevailed, and the Senate has adopted the Conference Committee report on House Bill 792. Chair recognizes the senator from the 4th.
Mr. President, I move the Senate order House Bill 792 immediately transmitted to the governor.
Senator from the 4th has asked for the Senate to immediately transmit to the governor House Bill 792. This is a roll call vote. All those in favor of the motion signify. Does the senator want to speak to the motion? He waves. All those in favor press the yea button. All those opposed the no. Mr. Secretary, please open the machine. On the passage of the motion, the yeas are 54, the nays are 0, and this chamber has agreed to immediately transmit House Bill 792 to the governor. Chair recognizes the majority leader. Mr. Secretary, can you please read the captions?
Senate Bill number 463 by Senator Kennedy of the 18th and others. A bill to be titled an act to amend Chapter 2 of Title I of the Official Code of Georgia Annotated relating to primaries and elections generally, so as to remove provisions of references regarding direct recording electronic voting machines, to revise certain duties of the State Election Board, provide for the deadline of registering to vote in certain runoffs, provide for the number of voting booths or enclosures, to provide for the division of certain precincts under certain circumstances, and for other purposes. Mr. President, on March 3rd, 2020, the Senate Committee on Ethics recommends that this bill do pass by substitute. Respectfully submitted by Senator Kirkpatrick, Chair. Mr. President, substitute? No, captions. Senate Bill number 410 by Senator Kennedy of the 18th and others. A bill to be titled an act to amend Code Section 48.5.311 of the OCGA relating to creation of county boards of equalization, duties, review, and for other purposes. Mr. President, on March 2nd, Senate Bill number 480 by Senator Huffstetler of the 52nd. A bill to be titled an act to amend Article 1 of Chapter 2 of Title 48 of the OCGA relating to state administrative organizations so as to authorize compensation to be paid from sales and use tax collections on a contingency basis with respect to services that assist the Department of Revenue and for other purposes. That completes order, Mr. President.
The majority leader has asked for unanimous consent that the following bills, Senate Bill 463, Senate Bill 410, Senate Bill 480, be engrossed. Is there objection? There's objection. Would the majority leader like to speak to his motion? Chair recognizes the majority leader.
Thank you, Mr. President. For the members of the Senate, as we've mentioned a couple times before already this session, it has been a decades-long precedent that ethics bills and finance bills be engrossed. The two finance bills, if I remember right, both came out of committee unanimously, bipartisan bills. I understand that there will be a vigorous conversation about the ethics bill, and I welcome that discourse in here, but we don't need to mess up the great work that we've already put in the committee process. I yield the well, Mr. President.
Majority leader has yielded the well. The chair recognizes the minority leader to speak to the motion.
I would ask every member to consider defeating this motion today so that we can perfect the elections bill. There's some obvious things that could be improved in that bill that we have not had a chance. I mean, very, very seriously, when we talk about lowering the standard on having uniformity and legal and fair elections, we're talking about doing the reverse of what the citizens of Georgia want. When we talk about other elements of this bill that we know can be improved, we're doing a disservice to the citizens of this Georgia if we don't work on that. So I urge you all to vote against the engrossment motion. Thank you.
Any other senator wish to speak for or against the motion? The chair sees none. Questions on the engrossment of Senate Bill 463, Senate Bill 410, and Senate Bill 480. All of those in favor of engrossing will vote yea. Opposed, nay. The secretary will unlock the machine. On the motion to engross, the yeas are 34, the nays are 21. The motion passes, and SB 463, 410, and 480 are engrossed. We're now moving on to the rules calendar. Mr. Secretary, can you please read the caption of Senate Bill 423?
Senate Bill number 423 by Senator Albers of the 56th and others. The bill to be titled An Act to Amend Code Section 16561 of the OCGA relating to hazing, so as to provide for an expanded definition of hazing, to amend Chapter 1 of Title 20 of the OCGA relating to education generally, to amend Part 3 of Article 2 of Chapter 3 of Title 20 of the OCGA relating to student organization responsibility for drug abuse, so as to make student organizations responsible for hazing and for other purposes. Mr. President, on March 5th, 2020, the Senate Committee on Judiciary recommends that this bill do pass by substitute, submitted by Senator Stone, the 23rd chair. Mr. President, the Senate Committee on Judiciary offers the following substitute to Senate Bill 423, a bill to be titled An Act to Amend Code Section 16561 of the OCGA relating to hazing, so as to provide for an expanded definition of hazing, provide for inclusion of minors as the subject of hazing, provide for penalties, provide for the Attorney General to bring civil actions against certain organizations regarding hazing incidents, to amend Chapter 1 of Title 20 of the OCGA relating to general provisions regarding education, so as to provide for mandatory reports of hazing-related violations at schools in the state, to provide for and revise definitions and for other purposes. That completes the order, Mr. President.
Chair recognizes the senator from the 56th to speak to Senate Bill 423.
Thank you, Mr. President. My fellow senators, I am humbled to bring this most important piece of legislation to you today. Senate Bill 423, the Max Groover Act, is a bill to protect our college students. Both online and in the Senate gallery today, we have Max's parents, Steve and Rayanne Groover, his brother Alex, his cousin Charlie, as well as numerous members of fraternities, sororities, and clubs in support of them. I'm going to ask those that are here in the gallery to please stand up so we can recognize you. My good friend Becky Nelson introduced me to Rayanne and Steve Groover. And when I first met them, I let them know that I myself was a brother of Sigma Phi Epsilon and on our alumni board for many years. They understood and were gracious in their mission. You see, Max lost his life in a preventable hazing accident in 2017. Max was full of life, a son, a brother, a cousin, and a friend to all with a bright future, which was cut way too short. His parents started the Max Groover Foundation and have created a legacy. I'm wearing a bracelet, as many others are today, in honor of the work that they are doing all over the nation to educate, create accountability, and transparency for these organizations. Every day, they're making a difference and honoring Max with their tireless work. The courage of the Groovers is overwhelming to me, and I hope is inspiration to all of us and to the thousands of lives they are touching. This bill, the Max Groover Act, will ultimately save lives. Since it has been recorded, over 200 young women and men have lost their lives in hazing incidents, from intentional bodily harm, drinking, drugs, and extreme actions in organized groups both on and off campus. Most sororities, fraternities, bands, and clubs are good. They provide lifelong, treasured friendships, positive experiences, and service to their schools and community. However, there has been abuse, and that abuse has been covered up in many instances to prevent from negative press and perceptions. Today, we shine a light on this issue of hazing with the Max Groover Act. Let me tell you what this bill does to make important changes to our law. First, it defines hazing in detail and establishes higher penalties, specifically if you're forced into a situation which would cause bodily harm or death, It raises that to a felony and a fine up to $50,000. It creates a misdemeanor criminal penalty for failing to render reasonable assistance, but at the same time offers protection to those who act in good faith in a timely manner to prevent and report these crimes. It provides for the Attorney General of our state to bring a civil action against these organizations relating to hazing with the goal of prompting more governance and oversight from alumni boards and national organizations. And lastly, we will have our colleges and universities provide a public report of hazing violations with specifics to provide the much-needed transparency. I call this the truth in advertising part of this legislation to assure students and parents alike are well informed. I want to thank the feedback from the governor's office, from our lieutenant governor's office, our universities and private colleges, and specifically the chairman of Judiciary, the senator from the 23rd, for their wisdom and their input. And I want to thank all of the national organizations, fraternities, sororities, clubs, and other organized groups that are here to support this bill. My fellow senators, I'm going to ask for your vote today to honor the legacy of Max Groover, his family, and all of those who rallied to make a difference. Mr. President, I will yield for any questions.
Chair recognizes the senator from the 38th for a question.
Will the senator yield?
I yield.
Is it not true that most of the organizations, if not all, have already passed policies for local organizations that they work with against hazing?
Thank you for your question, Senator. Many organizations do have policies, procedures, or guidelines preventing that from happening. Some are certainly stronger than others. This does address the law to make sure if someone breaks the law and goes past that, that there will be accountability, as well as the transparency of making sure that when something happens, it is open to the public.
And I'm just going to make one further comment at this point. My mother went into a sorority back in the 40s, which had already passed that, which I'm a member of now, already passed that law. And so I'm happy that you've done this. I hope it will have some teeth in it, because it definitely didn't have teeth in it when I came through the sorority 30 plus years after my mother. So I do certainly hope that this will put some teeth in it and people will pay attention, because there is no reason under the sun that I would want to haze a person that wanted to be my sister.
Thank you so much, Senator.
Chair recognizes the senator from the 6th for a question.
Will the senator yield?
I yield.
Senator, I was in the judiciary hearing when Max's parents testified. My question is really, is this law necessary now? Are laws not being enforced? Are property owners not doing what they're supposed to be doing to prevent people from criminal acts such as hazing and the like?
Thank you, Senator, and I appreciate your support in the Judiciary Committee. This obviously enhances criminal penalties like other things in the law. When someone does something intentionally and forces someone to the point where severe bodily harm or even loss of life occurs, I think most of us would agree that should be a felony. And then, consistent with other areas of the law, not stopping something from happening when you're around it or reporting it, does obviously cause concern. But likewise, we want to offer the protections for those that do stand up to that, and we want to make sure that the Attorney General can go after an organization should they not be doing the things they do. The goal is they never have to, because this is solved more proactively. but also transparency. Over the years, some of this stuff candidly had been swept under the rug, and I believe that providing that public report of what's happening, or that truth in advertising, if you will help students and parents alike make a better decision in the future should they want to join an organization.
Will the senator yield?
Yes.
And with respect to what you just said about not stopping something from happening, meaning hazing or other criminal activity, the person not stopping something, is that the fraternity or the sorority or the folks who own the fraternity or sorority house?
Well, that will be the folks that are there, member and present. So if that group of people, as an example, were together and it was happening, you can't just stand there and watch it happening as it's going on. If you see it happening, your goal is to get in there and immediately report it and or stop it.
And one more question.
Yes, Senator.
And with respect to any kind of local or national organization of a fraternity or sorority, obviously the powers that be aren't at the fraternity house or aren't at the sorority house. But this would also kind of create a level of liability, or at least allow the Attorney General to go after them if they knew or should have known this criminal activity was happening on their property.
That's correct, Senator. So most organizations, again, are doing an excellent job. But for those that are not, who knew this existed and didn't take those steps to discipline, to remove those chapters, to put those policies, procedures, and guidelines into place, then they should be held liable.
Thank you for this very important bill.
And thank you for your support.
Senator, you have no more questions.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senators, I appreciate your support today, and fly high, Max. Thank you.
Does any other senator wish to speak for or against Senate Bill 423? The chair sees none. The question is on the adoption of the committee substitute. Is there objection to adoption of the committee substitute? Chair hears none. The committee substitute is adopted. Is there objection to agreeing to the report of the committee which is favorable to the passage of the bill? The chair hears none. The report of the committee is agreed to. Is there objection to the main question being ordered? The chair hears none, and the main question is ordered. The question is on the passage of the bill by substitute. All those in favor will vote yea. Opposed, nay. The secretary will unlock the machine. On the passage of the bill, the yeas are 52, the nays are 0. This bill, having received the requisite constitutional majority, is therefore passed by substitute. Mr. Secretary, can you please read the caption to Senate Bill 463?
Senate Bill number 463 by Senator Kennedy of the 18th and others. A bill to be titled An Act to Amend Chapter 2 of Title 21 of the OCGA relating to primaries and elections generally, so as to remove provisions and references regarding direct recording electronic voting machines, revise certain duties of the State Election Board, provide for the deadline for registering to vote in certain runoffs, provide for the number of voting booths or enclosures and for other purposes. Mr. President, on March 3rd, 2020, the Senate Committee on Ethics recommends that this bill do pass by substitute. Respectfully submitted by Senator Kirkpatrick, the 32nd Chair. Mr. President, the Senate Committee on Ethics offers the following substitute to Senate Bill 463, a bill to be titled An Act to Amend Chapter 2 of Title 21 of the OCGA relating to primaries and elections generally, so as to remove provisions and references regarding direct recording electronic voting machines, to revise certain duties of the State Election Board, to provide for the deadline for registering to vote in certain runoffs, to provide for the number of voting booths or enclosures, to provide for the division of certain precincts under certain circumstances, to provide for certain reports on time required to vote, and for other purposes. That completes order, Mr. President.
Chair recognizes the senator from the 18th to speak to Senate Bill 463.
Good morning, colleagues, and thank you, Mr. President, for recognizing me. I bring to you Senate Bill 463, and this does some important things that will modify our interaction of our voters with voting machines and going to ensure some very positive effects coming up. The bill basically does four things. It does four things that are very important as we move into our 2020 election cycle, with the aim of ensuring that we in Georgia have smooth elections in this next election cycle. Number one, it requires counties to track the wait times and take action if voters have to wait more than an hour. We heard a lot of stories, and so did our Secretary of State, with regard to wait times, not only during the course of the day, but wait times after the polls had closed. And this seeks to address that, while at the same time allowing needed flexibility in equipment allocation for elections other than this upcoming November general election. This bill requires counties to track wait times in precincts of at least 3 times during the day and report that to the Secretary of State. If the wait time of our voters is more than an hour, then they'll have to split the precinct or provide more voting equipment or more poll workers or both in the next election. Now, it's important to remember such remedies for wait times would not apply this cycle but would apply to the next election. This is done in conjunction with providing the counties the needed flexibility in how they allocate equipment in elections other than the November general election. Secondly, it removes one of the things that's a bit confusing to voters with regard to registrations, and in that it syncs up voter registration deadlines for state and federal primary runoffs. Due to a federal court decision, Georgia now has a different voter registration deadlines for state primary runoffs than we have the deadline for federal primary runoffs, even though the elections are held on the same day. So you can certainly see how that would be confusing to voters. This makes it uniform so that everybody understands when they hear a deadline, it applies to whether state or federal runoffs for primaries. The third of the four things that this bill does is it provides and introduces a photo ID to verify absentee ballots as an option to someone who is submitting an absentee ballot. This is not a requirement, and there's no weight given to someone who does not submit this. But if you're submitting an absentee ballot and you want to provide that additional indicia that in fact you are the elector, you are the person properly signing, you are the person casting that ballot, you can simply make a copy of your driver's license, attach that to your absentee ballot, and that yet is one more item that can be used to consider in the event that there might be some ambiguity or some confusion. Again, not required. And then finally, there's some code cleanup sections in which the section is referring to Georgia's old voter system to make clear to anyone in looking at this and make sure that our code section is consistent. The references to the old voting machines that we had with regard to the DRE voting equipment is simply stricken to update, because as we all know, we've got new voting machines that our folks will be able to use in the next election cycle. That's what this bill does. It moves things in a positive way. It in no way changes the basis, the laws, the requirements, the rules with regard to how folks vote. It just provides some additional flexibility for the precincts so that they can make sure that our folks that go to vote do so in a timely manner and hopefully don't have to stand in line too long. Hopefully not long at all. With that, Mr. President, I'll be happy to answer any questions, or I'll yield the well.
Chair recognizes the minority leader for a question.
Senator Yield.
I certainly do.
Under the present laws, is it not true that at times local election officials are allowed presently to split precincts if the lines are way too long?
I'm not familiar with that, Senator. If you want to point me to that code section, I'll be glad to review the language with you. But if in fact that's the case, it seems rather odd, Senator, that I wouldn't have heard from you before now that perhaps this was unnecessary. We had a very vetted, very spirited discussion in the Senate Ethics Committee about this. No one has suggested that. No one's offered that language. No one has suggested that what's offered here is already in the law. So that would be something new.
Is it not true that many of us objected to elements of this bill in the Ethics Committee? In fact, many members voted against it.
Senator, in fact, that the objections really were threefold. They were, number one, it was an objection based on a misunderstanding that the photo ID was required. And I take it after reading the bill, you understand that that's not required. Number two, it was somehow this odd objection to having more precincts was going to somehow be a problem for voters. And the real oddity of that is that the complaint that we've heard before is that folks have to drive too far or precincts aren't more readily available. And obviously, if you take a precinct and you take an area and split it where you have two precincts, you've now made the voting location for our voters closer to where they live. So I don't see how that's not a good thing. So the objections that were lodged, quite frankly, did not come from a reading of the bill, would be my candid assessment with you of the committee hearing on this bill.
This is not further to, Senator, that many of us disagree with you.
Some of y'all voted against it, but again, Senator, that was many, many days ago, and no one has come to me with objections about the bill that you're talking about today.
Chair recognizes the senator from the 17th for a question.
Does Senator yield?
I do.
Senator, one of the concerns that I have in areas where population especially has grown over the last 10 years, you have precincts where you may have lines that are so long, especially new voting machines, that could actually discourage people from voting. How does your bill address that with the splitting of precincts?
Thank you, Senator. I appreciate that. Not only does this bill encompass the idea that if you have too long of a line, more than an hour after the polls close, this bill actually says that the precincts, the folks there, have to do 3 time checks during the course of the day. So it's a very measured, very intentional way of making sure that our voters, regardless of if they're the first ones to the polls or they're the last ones to the polls, it's going to allow for the splitting of precincts, which is adding the number of places where people get to go vote if those lines are too long. So thank you for the question.
Do you further yield?
I do.
One of the concerns I heard, though, in the regard to splitting precincts is you could have a precinct that split during an election, and someone's used to going to one place to vote, they're told that's where they should go vote, and they show up and suddenly the rules have changed. Does your bill say that precincts can be split once an election has started?
It says, in fact, it cannot, Senator, and I appreciate that. And you're right. You were in the committee meeting, and that was one of the points of confusion that some of the people, again, who had not read the bill thought that it did that. This says that you take that data, you take those wait times, and if, in fact, they're excessive and precincts need to be split, you don't do it during that election cycle. You do it in the next election cycle. So that gives all the time to let folks know where, in fact, if they have a new precinct to vote in, they're able to go to.
Do you further yield?
Yes, sir, I do.
When it comes to absentee ballots and the option in your bill of putting a copy of your driver's license in with your ballot, there was some concern about those who may not have a driver's license or may not have the ability to actually make a copy at home. Is that something that's mandatory?
It's not mandatory, Senator, and thanks for the question. And that's why the legislation is written so that it is not mandatory. It's not required. There's nothing about it that compels anyone to do that. That is totally your option as an elector if you want to do that as an additional way of verifying or indicia that you are, in fact, the person who signed the absentee ballot, that you're voting to make sure you're, that's you, then you can do that if you want to, and if you don't, there is no consequence to not doing it.
You take one more question?
Yes, sir.
Just to make sure we're clear then, if someone voted in the past by absentee ballot, they can still vote the exact same way once your bill becomes law moving forward?
Yes, sir, the exact same way.
Thank you.
Does the senator continue to yield?
Yes, sir.
Chair recognizes the senator from the 26th for a question.
Thank you, Mr. President. The gentleman yield.
I do, to my good friend from Macon.
Why would we split precincts when we've had problems with split precincts? Isn't it true that the state is supposed to provide the machines in order for the folks to vote? And isn't it also true that Mabel White is one of the largest voting precincts in Macon, almost 8,000? So if you don't provide enough machines, your wait time is going to be long. And then why would we put on an ID on absentee ballot? You say it's not required. Well, why would you put it in there?
Senator, I'll take the second question first, and that is, if you wanted, totally your option, if you want to provide a copy of your driver's license as an additional confirmation that you are who the absentee ballot elector says they are, that's simply an option. And it's one more way to perhaps remove some ambiguity. The biggest problem that they have had in the past, Senator, you may already know this, the biggest issue they've had with absentee ballots and kicking them out is where it's not signed. It's not signed. So whether or not that would remedy that, I don't know, but it certainly moves it in the direction of having a much greater likelihood that the absentee ballot is received, accepted, and counted if you've got confirmation that your ballot, that your driver's license verifies that you are the person that's submitting that ballot. With regard to your first question on splitting precincts, I would refer you to Section 5 of the bill beginning at lines 57, which still has the requirement that if the previous precinct contained more than 2,000 electors, and if all of those electors desire to vote, had not completed voting within 1 hour of the closing polls. And I would tell you for the balance of that section, Senator, the reference to the 2,000 electors, those metrics for the number of machines that are required per electors is not changed here. So the only thing that's possible as a result of this is that you would have the same number of machines per elector, but you would have more precincts for our voters to get to go to, which necessarily means our folks would be going to, in most any case, a closer polling place than where they have now. If you take a geographic area and you divide it in two and you put 2 polling places, folks can now go to something that's closer. This addresses one of the complaints that we've heard, we probably as senators heard and as legislators heard, about our polling places too far. Maybe we don't have enough. And I've heard certain folks of the Democratic Party complain we don't have enough. And so this seeks to address that. So it moves it in the right direction any which way you look at it.
Gentleman for the year.
Yes, sir, I do.
Isn't it true that the problems we had with absentee ballots are the folks saying the signatures don't look like the same signature when I was 22 versus I'm 75 now?
No, sir. The main problem they have is ballots that are turned in that are not signed. That is by far the vast majority of problems with ballots that are rejected or potentially rejected is they're simply not signed by the elector. That's the vast majority of the problem.
With the gentleman for the year.
Yes, sir.
Isn't it true that on election days, a lot of folks go to vote when they get off from work and will be in line after 7 o'clock because they all decided to show up after work?
Yes, sir. And based on that, you ought to love and vote for this bill, Senator, because this says if that line is over an hour after the polls close, then that's a reason that the local election boards can do things to improve those conditions, including splitting the precinct, or including adding more machines, or including adding more poll workers. There's 3 aspects that can be done to try to remedy the very problem you're talking about. And I concur with you. That's a potential problem, and that's one of the things we're trying to solve.
Senator, continue to yield.
Yes, sir.
Chair recognizes the senator from the 6th for a question.
Thank you, Mr. President. Will the senator yield?
I do.
In terms of the spirited discussion in the Ethics Committee, I remember that there was a question with respect to, is this bill going to go into effect as of this upcoming election? And I believe the response was that it was not. Am I remembering correctly?
No, this does impact this election, but the spirited discussion was whether or not, if there was a wait time, could the precincts be divided, could precincts be changed during the election cycle? That was the question and that was the concern. And quite frankly, Senator, I would agree with you and agree with the questioner if in fact that could have happened. That would be a concern because that could create confusion among someone who thinks right near the time of the election that they know where their precinct is, and it gets split and they're transferred to another precinct. This does not do that. What this does allow is, in fact, if we have those persistent problems with wait times, it allows the local boards to split the precincts on the next election cycle.
Will the senator yield?
Yes.
And so with respect to that, you would agree with me that this is going to go into effect as soon as the governor signs it, correct?
When you say this, as any bill, when the governor signs any bill, the bill goes into effect. But
Well,
that does not change my answer to your last question.
Immediately, correct? Sometimes we put times for effectiveness, June 1, January 1, but here, with respect to this bill, as
Yes.
soon as the governor signs it, it'll go into effect, correct?
Yes.
Okay. With respect to that, you keep talking about how precincts can't be split during an election cycle. What do you believe an election cycle is?
Well, what I mean by that, when precincts can't be split, precincts would be split because of the wait time issue. So therefore, until you've had the election and you have wait time cycles, or excuse me, you have wait time problems at that election, the bill clearly says it would be the following election cycle, not the 2020 election cycle where precincts could be split. The bill's very clear in that regard.
Can you point me to the line where it says the election cycle as opposed to the next election, which would include, for example, we have the presidential preference primary coming up. Let's say there are long lines with respect to that. Isn't it true that then the local board of elections could then split precincts in July and then also split them again for November as well?
Senator, I'm looking, I think it's in Section 5, but I'm not sure. But my recollection and my belief is that the bill is clear. If you think there's language that's inconsistent with what I'm representing, then I'm happy for you to direct my attention to that. But I think it's clear that this applies to the subsequent election cycle.
And so with respect to the word
Well,
cycle,
excuse me. I think if you look on line 76, the next general election.
in terms of the notice, no later than 60 days, correct, of the next general election. Which
before the next general election.
Right. Which then means that the precincts can be split after the presidential preference primary coming up if there are long lines for the next general election, which is in 2020, correct?
I believe this is referring to the next general election cycle, which would be 2022 as the next general election cycle.
And with respect to that, can you point to me the word cycle and or the word the 2022?
Yeah, it's not in there because next means next, and next after 2020 would be 2022.
The next general election, which is November of 2020, correct?
No, the next after, because you have to have the data with regard to a wait time. You have to have an election in which you have long waits, and then you apply this. If the decision is of a local election board to split the precinct, you do it on the next one.
And with respect to the prior election, it says previous primary election or runoff, correct? Not general. And that's line 70.
It says if at the previous primary election or runoff, yes.
So it is a correct statement that in the general election of 2020, that precincts will be able to be split and changed based on wait lines from the presidential primary, preference primary, or any of the other primaries that come before the general election in 2020.
Again, Senator, that's not my understanding, but if that's your reading, that's your reading.
And one last question, Senator, will you yield?
Yes.
Do you have any concerns about trying to change the rules of the game in the middle of an election cycle when we have so much litigation that is currently pending with respect to the state's handling of previous elections?
Senator, I appreciate the question. The answer is no when the changes we're making are in favor of voters, in favor of potentially more locations, in favor of potentially more machines at locations, in favor of potentially more poll workers at locations.
Does the senator continue to yield?
I'll yield for one more, Mr. President.
Chair recognizes the senator from the 27th.
Thank you, Mr. President. The senator yield?
I do. Thank you.
I want to make sure I understand the before and after impacts of this bill as it relates to the option to provide identification. So I want to point you to lines 181 through lines 189. And isn't it true that today if a signature is either missing or does not match, it is an automatic disqualification of the ballot?
That's my understanding.
Do you further yield?
Yes.
And isn't it true that line 186 adds a new provision to the law, I think to address the concern of the senator from the 26th, that would state that now, if the signature has changed from the time you were 22 till you were 75 and the signature did not match, you could proactively provide a copy of your identification, and your absentee ballot, according to line 87, shall, that no ballot shall be rejected. Isn't that true?
It is, Senator, and I appreciate the question, and that's a great clarification, a better clarification than I provided. You're right. Beginning at line 186, it says, no absentee ballot shall be rejected pursuant to this paragraph on the grounds that the signature does not appear to be valid if if the elector provided a photocopy of one of the forms of identification listed along with the absentee ballot.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Mr. President, I'll yield the well.
Senator has yielded the well. Chair recognizes the minority leader to speak to the bill. Chair recognizes the senator from the 22nd to speak to the bill.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise in opposition to the bill. I'll be brief based on the fact we have so many bills, but just want to point out a couple of issues that we're having, and a lot of those have already been kind of pointed out already. But one of the things to make note of is that this bill, of course, is a response to some level of response to significant litigation that had been taking place. But yet, even though it is a response to that or trying to meet all the different litigation that is taking place that has placed Georgia on the map as far as electoral issues across the nation, we only had about 3 or 4 days to actually even do any vetting of this particular bill. So when you start trying to have a deliberative understanding of it, it's just not there. So that's number one issue, that you have something that affects not only the state, but we've been seeing across the nation as far as having some electoral issues, but yet we only had about 4 days to even look at this before it went into committee and had a hearing. But also, let's also remember that words do matter, and that we sometimes talk about lawyer bills and something of that nature, but words actually do matter. So if we look at line 17, for instance, we see that we've changed the standard from promulgating rules and regulations so as to obtain uniformity to only promoting uniformity. And that may seem like it's small, but those are actually things that can be major as far as actually your desire to actually get towards uniformity. So we go to the standard of obtaining uniformity to actually just wanting to promote uniformity. Words in the law do matter, and that actually lessens the standard that exists. But also, sometimes you can put things in a bill which actually can create more issues than you believe that it actually does. And one of the issues that we've been discussing here is the aspect of the absentee ballots and as far as the signature is concerned. But one of the issues then becomes on line 186 through 189 on page 6 is would persons then fall back as far as would persons who are looking at these absentee ballots fall back and say, well, there is no photocopy in the machine, even though that's not an automatic rejection? Would persons say, well, because there is no photocopy in the absentee ballot, if there is a discrepancy or we think there is one, now they actually err on the side and say, well, since there is no photocopy, you actually would not actually allow that ballot to go through. That becomes a serious question that has not been discussed at all, and it becomes a question that needs more time to be looked into, to where a person would say, well, since this signature does not look the same, or since this signature has some issues, that person probably would have understood, because of this law, to put their photocopy in there, and if they didn't do that, then therefore maybe we should go ahead and reject it. It may be one of those unintended consequences, but once again, those are the type of things that could be discussed more thoroughly if we had the opportunity to do that. This is a significant piece of legislation that affects the very rights of our democracy as far as our voting is concerned. And we're changing the rules of the game right here in the middle. For instance, and the senator from the 6 pointed it out, I was able to present a bill, or at least had one, dealing with felons and voting rights. We did not say that that would become immediate upon the governor's signature. We put that down as far as its effective date down the road. The reason that even though I wanted that to go through was we don't want to interfere with the current election process. We have a process today. Let's deal with that process instead of changing it. But also, let's look at page 5. When we start talking about lines 135 through 144, which we say that the election superintendent should have at least one voting booth or enclosure for each 250 electors therein. Sounds very good, can be very good, but the question becomes, is that a floor or is that a ceiling? But also what becomes important is that the next line, we see that for other primary election and runoffs, the county or municipal election superintendent may provide for a greater or lesser number of voting booths or enclosures if after a thorough consideration of the type of election, expected turnout, number of electors who've already voted. That shows that they're going to be really looking into the issue about how many machines they have. Understand why that language is there, but similar language doesn't appear that it will affect an election in 2020 or an election that is in an even number year. So do you have that same type of thorough examination if you're talking about a general election in an even number year? Or is it simply going to be that you're going to have a floor of 250 booths? Those are questions that should come up. With that type of understanding, with those types of discrepancies or issues, at least that persons may have, to change the rules at this particular point in time becomes very problematic. And that is why I stand in opposition, because we're dealing with something that is so fundamental to what we know as far as voting is concerned. Why are we rushing this through? That is the question that is out there. But I will yield for any questions, Mr. President.
Chair recognizes the senator from the 15th for a question.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Yield.
Yes.
Senator, isn't it true, or is it true that this bill seems to remove the obligation of the State Elections Board to ensure legality and purity of elections and to ensure the responsibility that the counties follow federal voting laws? Is that true? That could result in more and more costs to the counties?
It certainly could do that. And also I would point not only that, and that's a very excellent point, Senator, but I also would point, and that is correct, but I also would point out that when we look at line 135 on page 5, also look at the language that says that's been struck out. The current language is, as far as the voting systems is concerned, it says the county election superintendent, the county or, it wasn't or, election superintendent or municipal governing authority shall provide at least one voting booth. Now all of a sudden, it's now just the election superintendent. It takes the county out of that, because it's no longer an or municipal governing authority. It's just the county election superintendent, not the county itself. So that's one of the questions also.
Senator,
yes, I do further yield.
One final question, Senator. The voting machines, in 2018, Georgians faced the longest lines in the country while waiting to cast ballots. Now it seems to reduce the voting resources. It changes the voting requirement for voting machines from a larger number to a smaller number. Are you concerned about that at all?
Absolutely. We're definitely concerned about that. But I think with your point that also should be stated is that these are legitimate issues and legitimate concerns that are out there, and that these concerns are not going to be able to be met in rushing through this bill at this particular point in time. The concerns, the bill itself may come from a standpoint of wanting to address a myriad of issues with absolutely no malice in anyone's heart. But the problem becomes they still can have secondary effects. And those are the things that we need to be discussing, and we've not been able to do that. That's the question.
Thank you, Senator.
Yes. I'll yield for any further questions, Mr. President.
Senator, continue to yield?
Yes.
Chair recognizes the senator from the 38th for a question.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator, my question really was going to be directed to the previous speaker, or previous senator, but my question is about, we're concerned about long voting lines. Several years ago, this body and the House, the General Assembly, changed our early voting laws.
Correct.
When we had early voting, we didn't have to worry about split precincts and all of this that this bill is doing. So was that not an effective way to deal with this situation that we took away from the public?
And thank you, Senator, for the question. And that would be certainly something that we would want to examine. Those are things that actually could be within this bill, within this structure. And those are actually issues that are out there that we've not properly addressed. And so therefore, that's the question. Why are we not? Then this was also engrossed. Why are we not able to add to this particular bill? That also becomes very problematic. So this is a very problematic situation that we need to address. Obviously, we need to do this. There's no doubt about that. But as you said, how about the absentee voting time? Many persons are actually voting absentee or voting early, but yet we're not actually fixing that. So there's so many different issues with this particular bill. Many that I pointed out, many that others have actually pointed out, that we ought to not move so fast when we're so close to an election. That's the key point. When we're so close to an election, to where, as I mentioned, and I think this is key, to where even we had it opportunity to try to change who votes in our state. But even recognize we're not going to change the rules in the middle of the ground, in the middle of the game. We're going to wait. Even if we were to pass that, we're still going to wait. Why not wait here? And with that, Mr. President, I yield the well.
Senator has yielded the well. Chair recognizes the minority leader to speak to the measure.
Members of the Senate, Mr. President, I appreciate it because this is an important bill, and we should be able to get the facts and make sure they're understood. One, I asked the person in the well, do local election boards presently have the power to split precincts? I want you to know that our election boards across the state try hard to make sure there is access to the voting systems for their citizens. Right now, every year, the elections board are constantly managing the election system that they have. And they want to make sure that the system is fair to people. They have churches or schools that call and say, hey, I won't do the voting precinct next year. So they have to they are forced to relocate election locations, etc. Every year, if you don't think an election board in a county knows which precinct is going 3 or 4 hours, I know in DeKalb, they know which precincts are taking 3 or 4 hours and have waits today. And they can address that in the upcoming election. They can split precincts if they want. They have that authority under state law today. What we don't need is a primary system or any system implemented that doesn't allow those local elected officials that are looking out for the best of our citizens to be overridden by any system that makes them change a precinct in the middle of an election from a May to a general election if they don't think it's going to help turnout and help access the polls for our citizens. You know, 463 was dropped on a Friday, and you know, I think I was somewhat dressed down for not bringing amendments or coming with this. I want you to know this was dropped on a Friday. It was read and assigned on a Monday, and it went to committee on a Tuesday. If you want this party, the minority party, to have input on an election bill, one of the most important things to my constituents, and you are the Secretary of State of Georgia, you don't bring a bill and get it assigned to committee on Monday and bring it into committee on Tuesday. You do not do that. This is too important. I called Mr. Teasley on Friday. He had been by my office to see me, and I give him that respect. But I called him last Friday, and I haven't heard back. I come to the well today with amendments to make this bill better because I want to work with the majority party to create a bill that will increase access. You know, I didn't bring crazy bills. I think there should be a 1 to 200 ratio, not a 1 to 250. I think there should be more machines for our voters. But I didn't bring crazy amendments. I brought amendments to make this bill better. But am I allowed to hear them or bring them or have them voted on? No. No, I am not. I cannot vote for this bill, and I urge members of this body to vote against it.
Senator has yielded the well. Chair recognizes the senator from the 55th to speak to the measure.
Thank you, Mr. President, members of the Senate. For years in the past, I registered people to vote. I was not even thinking about coming to this body to be a member. But since I did, from year to year, I've seen those rights reduced from those same people that I registered to vote. And makes me wonder if they could hold strong and still go to the polls and vote after all of the things that we've done. And here we are again in 2020, removing some of those rights. And I just have a few things that I want to say about this bill, which I intend to vote against because, as the minority leader just said, we did not have an opportunity in the committee to perfect the bill. We did not have an opportunity to offer amendments so that this bill could be better, and perhaps we could vote for it. It was rushed. The minority party did not have the opportunity to have a say. And I will probably repeat some of the things that have already been said, questions that have been asked, because they're important. These things need to be heard. And as someone else said, in 2018, Georgia faced the longest lines in the country while waiting to cast their ballot. Now, this bill will reduce resources. It reduces the requirement for voting machines from 1 per 250. They don't have to, the precincts don't have to meet those requirements. They could have less or more. The net effect of this change will reduce the number of voting machines counties are required to have on hand. What we really should be doing is allocating additional funds for counties to find polling places that are reliable. Granted, adding voting locations may be necessary. However, this should be done by adding more resources, finding locations that are convenient, and notifying people that your precincts have been changed. And even when that happens, the voters don't always get the notices. It's not our fault that the mail get messed up sometime, but it happens. Senate Bill 463 creates an unfunded mandate to curb long lines using 3 tools: precinct splitting, adding voting machines, and adding poll workers. Without a source of funding, many counties may err on the side of the cheapest fix. For example, because of the way Senate Bill 463 is written, a county could choose to split a precinct but not move it from the current polling place. Not enough people to man the precinct. You can't split up a precinct and don't bring more people in to help man it. As I mentioned before, lack of notice for poll changes. That was one of the things we talked about in the committee, that the notice may go out, but the person may not get it. They show up at their usual polling place, and they can't vote because it's been moved someplace else. They may not have transportation. These seem to us, it's nothing if we have to go someplace else to vote. Some people don't have that transportation. They don't have the resources that everybody in this body may have. And the last couple of things I want to say. Making changes without sufficient public input and public knowledge may lead to a lack of trust in the process for constituents. All long lines data and subsequent decisions to split or not split a precinct should be made public immediately and be subject to public input. And there was one thing I also wanted to say about adding precincts as well. That's not always the best thing to do. I've witnessed the confusion that splitting precincts can cause. I guess I just have a huge issue with splitting precincts because I know and I've seen it. That is not the best thing to do. Mr. President and members of the Senate, I appreciate your listening to me. If there are questions that I can answer, I will yield.
Chair recognizes the senator from the 10th for a question.
Thank you, Mr. President. Would the senator yield?
I yield.
Senator, I wanted to drill down a little bit further in section 2 over on page 1 of this bill, and it deals with the state election board. It appears as if this bill offers some kind of blanket identification to the state election board because it removed that language as well as the legality and purity. So if the state election board has no legal obligation to the county or municipal superintendents, is there another entity in the state that would?
Unless the Secretary of State's office does their job.
Senator, further yield?
I yield.
Senator, I noticed that in this language that it did not reference the Secretary of State's office. So are we to assume that this bill kind of grants some kind of immunity to the state election board? And it certainly doesn't reference the Secretary of State's office either. Would that be a fair conclusion, Senator? What do you think?
If the senators so state.
Senator, over on page 4 of this bill, and these are questions I would have liked to have asked the author of the legislation, but he didn't, and I thank you for trying to work through this, and perhaps I'm just venting, but if you can shed some light on it, on your thoughts as well. It states over on line 114, it talks about relating to the correction of mistakes and omissions on ballots.
Senator, I don't have the bill, so I can't follow you on that.
I understand, Senator, and that's why I'm kind of mentioning it to you, but over on section 7, it does talk about relating to corrections of mistakes and omissions on ballots. In this subsection, it talks about how the superintendent, and I think it's been mentioned by the author of this legislation that the responsibility now has been shifted to the city or the county superintendents. So it appears as if this bill gives the authority to correct those mistakes to the county or municipal superintendent. Is that a fair conclusion?
It could be, Senator.
Senator, further yield?
I yield.
Senator, when I read further down in this bill, when it talks about the mistakes, and you would agree that this last general election, there was allegations of a lot of mistakes made on ballots, is that correct?
That is correct.
And I also believe you further yield there's mistakes made on counting of the absentee ballots, is that correct?
That is correct.
So, Senator, given what we know from the last general election of the mistakes that were made on ballots, including absentee ballots, why would you think this bill would give that kind of blanket immunity to the state election boards? I would think that the state election board should have more responsibility in ensuring that ballots are corrected and counted and absentee ballots are corrected and counted. Would you agree with me on that, Senator?
I wholeheartedly agree with that statement.
I'm sorry, Senator?
I wholeheartedly agree with that statement that they should have more responsibility.
Thank you, Senator.
You're welcome.
The senator continue to yield.
I yield.
Chair recognizes the senator from the 26th for a question.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator yield.
I yield.
Senator, isn't it true the lines are going to be longer this election because the machines have changed?
The lines are going to be long.
Right. And that the machines were gotten out late, so it was hard to put them in communities so folks could understand how to vote. But isn't it true you have to vote? It prints a paper and you put it in a tabulator.
That's right.
And the tabulator doesn't have about 1,500, take about 1,500 sheets of paper. And the question, isn't it true, the question is, when the tabulator runs out of paper, somebody has to go back and replace it. And isn't it true that when somebody has to replace it, that means it takes time to put the paper in the machine while folks are standing in line in order to vote? Isn't that true?
That is true.
Senator, you have no more questions.
Thank you. I yield.
Chair recognizes the senator from the 35th for a question, or to speak to the bill. Chair recognizes the senator from the 35th to speak to the bill.
Thank you, Mr. President. I really wanted to vote for this bill, but then this thing called engrossment came. And I could not put my amendments on it. It stifled the voice that the people wanted me to have when they elected me. And it stops us from speaking up and speaking out. So now I cannot vote for it because I had an amendment prepared to talk about those with strokes or Parkinson's disease or muscular dystrophy whose signature now is different from what they signed on. And I know if I can get a card, because I have a new knee from my doctor that says that I have metal, doctors give stroke victims and others that same card. So this would have been added so that the signatures would be not be questioned. As well as my other one was about the absentee ballots, and it passed this body last year, but it didn't pass the House, so it came back over. And what happens now in absentee ballots, you put your information and your signature on the outside of the absentee ballot. This is identity fraud time where people's signatures and information are being stolen. So I wanted this amendment to go on this legislation, since it's still stuck in committee, so that your signature, this is something that doesn't need to wait till next year or the next year. It needs to happen now. And the other one was something that needs to happen now, and it's that so many people are saying they are not voting at all because they have a fear of touching the screen because of the coronavirus. And this was just a simple thing to say those same sheets that you can sanitize your computer with be supplied to the machines, all of the precincts, as well as hand sanitizer, so that people can use it before they vote and after. And this is just a simple measure. And so these were three, I thought, very good amendments that you could have voted on, and we could have improved this bill. But again, our voices are silenced, and the people who sent me here would not like it if I voted for something that didn't include important measures. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer. If not, I yield the will, and I thank you, Mr. President.
Senator, you have no questions. Chair recognizes the senator from the 36th to speak to the bill.
Mr. President. Colleagues, I rise to speak against this bill and also to reflect, if you would join me in reflecting on the background of the debates in this legislature, in this state, and the practices that have been witnessed, recorded, with signed affidavits, the cases that are in court. Georgia has significant, profound, demonstrable issues around voting, access to the right to vote. In this very chamber in 2005, we were the first state in the nation to pass voter ID laws on the spurious, made-up narrative that people are sneaking in and voting under somebody else's name and trying to vote twice and all that kind of nonsense. Never, ever been documented or proven in any of the hearings, any of the extensive, exhaustive studies that have been made by people who wanted to find that to be true. And so it's just deeply disappointing to see the deaf ear of the Republican Party when genuine, significant complaints are recorded, documented, included in court cases, and yet once again we come with another bill that falls grievously short of correcting the problems in our state with ballot access. Now, I would recommend to you a film called Suppressed: The Fight for the Vote. It was a film that was made about the midterm elections here in our state, and it documents real people, people who lost their right to vote, people who mailed in an absentee ballot request and never received it, and they just say, well, no, we don't know what happened. No, it was mailed to you, you didn't receive it. If you could watch that film with an open mind and see people in tears about having their right to vote denied in this state, maybe you'd look at this differently. Maybe you wouldn't have rushed through a bill. You know, we looked at all across the country about allowing a Secretary of State to run for governor and at the same time supervise the election when he's on the ballot. That in itself should scream out, should cry out for reform. But instead we get a bill, as we so passionately heard from our minority leader, that was rushed through, pushed through, an overnight deal with very little opportunity for bipartisan working on the bill. You've heard, I appreciate the comments of the senator from the 35th. She brought you 3 concrete proposals that make a lot of sense and that are worthy of being included in an election reform bill. But there's no place for that to be considered. I participated in a town hall meeting in East Point, one of the towns that I represent, not just 3 weeks ago. The place was filled. We had 40 or 50 folks, mainly, almost overwhelmingly senior citizens. And the stories that I heard, a gentleman standing up saying, they sent me a letter saying I was an ex-felon and I couldn't vote. He's never served a day. He had no felony charges on him. Another woman, almost in tears, says, my husband and I had to wait for 2 hours before they would agree to give him a provisional ballot. He's been voting since he was 18, and he's now in his 70s, and that's what we were subjected to as Georgia citizens in East Point. These are not made-up stories. These are real people. In a room with about 50 citizens in East Point, 5 people stood up and gave firsthand accounts of how their effort to vote had been thwarted. And if you watch the film, which is available online, you can get it online. If you watch that 37-minute documentary and you listen to the stories of people that took 6 hours for them to vote. A woman is at her precinct, they say, well, no, you've got to go downtown to the main office in order to cast a provisional ballot. Have you ever heard such nonsense? She went down there and stood in another long line, and they got there, they said, no, honey, you go back to where you were. That's not the right thing. You've got to go back to your own precinct. Her own precinct had sent her downtown. Now, as she said, and she works in a medical setting. She had to take time off from work. She had to have her child race and pick him up at 6 o'clock for daycare, go back to the polling place, because every time she gets to one of these, there's a line that's 2 hours long. This is happening now in our state. Do you care? Do you care? Let's go beyond party. Are we going to stand up and fight for people to have the right to vote? Or are we going to continue to come with this kind of ploy where you race? If you really wanted full endpoint and you wanted to perfect and you want to address these issues that are documented in court cases going on right now in our federal court downtown, if you wanted to fix it, why wouldn't you sit down? Why wouldn't you have actually a working session where that's what you did? But instead you shut it down and then you castigate people because they're bringing up issues now, and you're trying to point fingers and make the minority party responsible that we're not going to vote for this bill because somehow we didn't participate enough in the committee. We should be ashamed. We are looked at as a national poster child for bad efforts on voting. And you can shake your heads. It's true if you care to read the national press. On the one fact alone of allowing a person who's running for governor to supervise the election in which they're running. The purges. We took the Secretary of State to court for enforcing this exact match. They went over to federal court and they negotiated a settlement. Mr. Secretary of State, will you agree not to do this anymore? If you'll agree not to do this anymore, this exact match, which is so problematic and is blocking people from the vote, will you agree not to do it? He said, yes, I won't do that. Do you know what he did? Came right back over here to this legislature and had a bill introduced and passed to put it in the Georgia Code that he could do that. Exact match. An exact match knocks off all, particularly people who come from other nations with other names, particularly African American people. But there's a member of one of the international organizations that works on relief and care, and he lives here in this country. He lives in our state. He is a citizen of long standing. He has a name that's Del Rio. And they said he couldn't vote because there was a space between Del and Rio on his license tag, but he didn't have a space on his ballot, on his voter. They had put his name in with no space between the Del and the Rio. He was outraged. Wouldn't you be? Wouldn't you be? But that's the exact match, which the court had gotten the Secretary of State to agree he wouldn't do, and then he came over here and codified it so he could keep doing it. We've had 500,000 people purged in one night back in 2017. The list goes on and on and on and on and on of abusive practices that block people from the right to vote here in our state. Shouldn't we be united in cleaning that up rather than obfuscating, attacking the minority party for not properly participating in a bill that was rushed through? This is the kind of bill that needs decisive digging down, working on the issues, looking at national models that work, etc. That's what we should have been doing. Instead, we're here with an engrossed bill on crossover day with no ability to offer any amendments. And I say to you, good people, people of goodwill, who believe that the right to vote is a fundamental cornerstone of our democracy. If you believe that, you should be standing up alongside anybody else that's fighting to clean up our voting process. When you hear the stories of people that took 6 hours to get their vote cast, and then you hear this one young lady, I could take you to her, I could introduce you to her. She called up the next day because they finally told her to cast that provisional ballot. She called the next day. Has my ballot been counted? My provisional ballot? Don't worry about that. You don't need to call anymore. We're counting all the ballots. And her mother had been a poll worker, and she said, honey, don't settle for that. You call them back. She called 2 or 3 times, and they all told her the same thing. Don't worry, we're counting all the provisional ballots. Then she called at the end of that week from the doctor's office where she worked, and they told her, No, your provisional ballot wasn't counted. That's the woman that had been told in the morning to go to go downtown to the central place. She drove down there, waited in line. Then they said, "No, you got to go back over there to your precinct." She went back over there and finally got a provisional ballot filed at 7 o'clock at night with her child in the back seat of the car. She had spent her entire day trying to cast her vote, and then she learns on a phone call to the registrar's office, "No, your provisional ballot didn't get counted." We have real issues, genuine issues, profound issues. We could do better, but somebody somewhere in the ranks of the leadership of this state decided to do it this way. Put this bill in that's going to have all sorts of consequences that will again create barriers and problems, rather than doing a bill in a bipartisan manner that would solve the problems that we've created in the past. I urge and encourage you, this bill's not ready for prime time. I urge you to join me in voting against it. I will yield for any questions. If there are none, I'll yield the well.
Chair recognizes the senator from the 44th for a question.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Senator, do you yield?
I yield.
And I'll try to be very quick with this. Isn't it true that most of us had got with our Board of Elections directors and had voting the machines there so that our senior citizens and many people in our community would know how to vote and not be afraid to go to the polls to vote and be able to use these new machines. And most of us saw the documentary Suppress and the Right to Vote, and participated in forums to answer questions from constituents who told us, do not vote for any barriers to keep black folk from voting. And isn't it true also that I agree with the amendments of the senator from the 35th? And this is an attempt. I just need a yes or no answer. Do you feel that this is an attempt, regardless of the blood that was shed on Bloody Sunday at the Edmund Pettus Bridge, isn't this an attempt to keep black folk and poor people from going to the polls to vote, and the suppression of the vote?
Senator, I agree with you wholeheartedly. My answer is yes. And I want to thank you for your decades of service in voter registration and voter participation that you have done throughout the years, long before you were ever elected as a senator, that's continued to this very day. Thank you for your advocacy and for standing up and speaking out on this. I yield for any other questions.
You have no more questions.
Thank you. I yield the well.
Chair recognizes the senator from the 34th to speak to the bill.
Thank you, Mr. President and members of the Senate. This is 2020. 2020 is often referred to your vision. But right now, I want to make sure we understand I'm standing here today in a chamber that I could not have envisioned me being a part of. Yet, I am here and proud to have served in this body for 18 years, and my district has blessed me with 2 more. But in recognition of the centennial of the 19th Amendment, we will honor women from the original suffrage movement, as well as 20th century and the 21st century, women who have continued to struggle fighting against poll taxes, literacy tests, voter roll purges. Let me say that again. Voter roll purges, and many other contemporary forms of voter suppression to ensure that women, who are the majority of the voters in this great state of Georgia, and I might add the nation, women should not be in any way, shape, or form not remembered this month of March, because we are part of this body. Though we may have small numbers in comparison, we're on the move, and I want us to make sure that we know that we're here. And I've heard the lawyers, no, I'm not a lawyer, but some of them are in agreement that there are problems with this bill. So my purpose for talking against engrossment is mainly because we can't fix it. Even when the lawyers agreed there are some fixes that should be done. As a woman in this body, during Women's Suffrage Month, I salute all the women who have fought, bled, and died, led the way, made sure that democracy counts for everybody. I stand here as a proud woman in the Georgia State Senate to say engrossment is wrong on this bill because it has flaws. Unintended, but it has flaws. Mr. President, I'll yield the well.
Senator has yielded the well. The chair recognizes the senator from, does any other senator wish to speak for or against Senate Bill 463? The chair sees none. Chair recognizes the senator from the 18th to close debate.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, colleagues. I appreciate the spirited debate, and I appreciate the comments and sentiments that have been expressed both for and against this bill. But let's talk now back about what does this bill do? What does this bill do? A simple reading of the bill shows that it operates to shorten voter lines and potentially add the number of precincts that our voters will be able to go to vote. More precincts than we have now means people will be going to a closer location to vote. As to the questions with regard to the effective date, even if you assume for a moment that the reading includes that you might have split precincts for the November general election based on primary voting lines, then all that does is fix the problem of voting lines. What's the problem with addressing the issue that we have with voters who have to stand in line too long? Where is the problem with that? If in fact there are changes, if in fact there are precincts that are split, there are sufficient and numerous legal requirements that we're all familiar with or know generally about with regard to letting the voters know when precincts are changed, and if in fact your voter precinct is changed and you don't register in the new precinct, the bill specifically says you can vote in your previous precinct. The bill also provides flexibility by doing three things. It allows to address the long line problems with either, number one, splitting of precincts. That means, folks, adding the number of polling places, or two, adding the number of machines, or number three, adding poll workers. Dividing precincts would obviously be subject to public notice and public input, and our local folks would make those decisions about what's best to do it for their areas. I appreciate the questions. Even though they're criticisms, I appreciate the questions, one of which was from the senator from the 38th, talking about when we had early voting, no long lines. Senator, we still have early voting. This bill doesn't do anything to address that, doesn't do anything to challenge that. The comments made by the minority leader that DeKalb County has 3 to 4 hour wait lines, then why aren't these being fixed? Why isn't that being addressed? And that's what this bill seeks to do. One of the arguments made by the minority leader was that, well, we didn't have enough time to review the bill. As I said in my opening comments, where were you before now? When did you call me? When did you approach me? The minority leader said he's talked to Mr. Sam Teasley, the Secretary of State's office. Mr. Teasley is not the author of this bill. He's not the sponsor of this bill. He's not a signer on the bill. I am. No one approached me and said, and came to see me or said, let me work with you or work with me. And part of that is the folks in this chamber know that I would not be involved in a piece of legislation that they accuse this legislation of doing. This bill arguably was made, it's been made the argument this somehow reduces resources. No, this bill doesn't reduce resources. It's the same number of machines that are available per the counties. One of the arguments made is that sometimes voters don't have transportation. This bill helps that. If the precincts are added and you have additional polling places, your transportation time and transportation distance is now less if that's done. It's really interesting to me, folks, that the Democrats have complained historically about precinct closures, and now they complain about precinct expansion. How can you argue both ways? How can there be opposition, truly opposition, to having more precincts, shorter lines for our voters, and better ways to ensure that absentee ballots actually get counted? Georgia has the most successful automatic voter registration policy in the country, according to the Brennan Center. It's never been easier to vote in Georgia. It's easier to register to vote in Georgia. We're the national model for elections because of 3 weeks of early voting, no excuse absentee voting, and automatic voter registration through DDS. Georgia's the only state to have had all 3 of those in place before the 2016 elections. Other states are joining us in what's been done in that regard. Again, I encourage your support for this bill. This simply gives our folks a better voting experience, a greater likelihood that the vote counts, shorter vote times, and the possibility of a closer precinct closer to where they live. That's simple, common sense approach legislation that's good for our voters. I appreciate your time and attention, and Mr. President, I yield the well.
Senator has yielded the well. The question is on the adoption of the committee substitute. Is there objection to adoption of the committee substitute? Chair hears none. The committee substitute is adopted. Is there objection to agreeing to the report of the committee which is favorable to the passage of the bill? The chair hears none, and the report of the committee is agreed to. Is there objection to the main question being ordered? The chair hears none, and the main question is ordered. Questions on the passage of the bill by substitute. All those in favor of the bill will vote yea. Opposed, nay. The secretary will unlock the machine. On the passage of the bill, the yeas are 35, the nays are 19. This bill, having received the requisite constitutional majority, is therefore passed by substitute. Mr. Secretary, can you please read the caption to Senate Bill 416?
Senate Bill number 416 by Senator Mullis of the 53rd and others. A bill to be titled an act to amend Code Section 2437 of the OCGA relating to the Office of College and Career Transitions and powers and duties so as to change the name of the Office of College and Career Transitions to the Office of College and Career Academies and for other purposes. Mr. President, on March 5th, 2020, the Senate Committee on Higher Education recommends that this bill do pass by substitute. Respectfully submitted by Senator Tippins, Chair. Mr. President, the Senate Committee on Higher Education offers the following substitute to Senate Bill 416, a bill to be titled an act to amend Code Section 2437 of the OCGA relating to the Office of College and Career Transitions and powers and duties so as to change the name to of the Office of College and Career Transitions to the Office of College and Career Academies. That completes the order, Mr. President.
Chair recognizes the senator from the 53rd to speak to Senate Bill 416.
Yes, yes, yes. Mr. President, another great bill for you. This is simple. And want to thank the chair of higher ed and that wonderful committee. We're simply changing the name of College and Career Academy's transition to the College and Career Academy's office. And we make sure that the locals have more control. And Mr. President, that's it. I yield the well.
Senator has yielded the well. Does any other senator wish to speak for or against Senate Bill 416? The chair sees none. The questions on the adoption of the committee substitute. Is there objection to adoption of the committee substitute? Chair hears none. The committee substitute is adopted. Is there objection to agreeing to the report of the committee which is favorable to the passage of the bill? The chair hears none. The report of the committee is agreed to. Is there objection to the main question being ordered? The chair hears none. The main question is ordered. Questions on the passage of the bill by substitute. All those in favor of the bill will vote yea. Opposed, nay. Secretary will unlock the machine. On the passage of the bill, the yeas are 55, the nays are 0. This bill, having received the requisite constitutional majority, is therefore passed by substitute. All right, if I could get everyone's attention for a moment, we're going to stand in recess till 2 o'clock, at which time we'll come back to order at 2 o'clock. I want to direct everybody to lunch is being served in the Secretary of the Senate's office. You can enter through the back door under the stairs. So we will stand in recess until 2 p.m. Thank you.